December 1944, Iwo Jima. Dawn breaks across the Pacific with the color of rusted iron. The air trembles, not from wind, but from engines. Nakajima fighters line the runway propellers, spinning into blurred halos of light. Japanese pilots climb into their cockpits, faces slick with sweat despite the cool morning. They believe in the element of surprise. They believe in distance. They believe the Americans are still blind beyond the horizon. Before the first wheel lifts from the earth, gunfire erupts from ships they cannot even see. Shells arc across the sky in precise trajectories. The pilots freeze. How they haven't even taken off. There were no scouts, no warning flares. Nothing visible gave them away. But something invisible did. Radar. Waves of energy pulsing through the air, whispering their presence to distant ships. The Japanese thought they were launching an attack. Instead, they were already seen, already known, already targeted. This is how technology shattered faith. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japan owned the sky. Their pilots were not merely trained, they were forged. Discipline carved into bone, precision woven into reflex. They flew with a confidence born from dominance, protected by something more powerful than armor, the illusion of distance. The Pacific Ocean stretched vast and indifferent between fleets. Thousands of miles of water, cloud, and horizon. For years, this emptiness was Japan's greatest ally. American ships moved slowly across these distances, their eyes limited to what men could see. Perhaps 20 miles on a clear day, less in fog or darkness. Beyond that, the world dissolved into uncertainty. But by 1943, something fundamental had shifted. Across the Pacific, on carriers and destroyers on remote islands and makeshift bases, a new presence emerged. Rotating dishes, humming equipment, screens glowing pale green in darkened rooms. Operators hunched over consoles watching sweeping lines paint arcs of light across circular displays. They were seeing what human eyes could not, aircraft 100 miles away, invisible beyond clouds, beyond night itself. The Americans had opened invisible eyes. Japan's commanders did not understand this transformation. They still thought in terms of visual contact, of reconnaissance planes and coastal spotters. They believed their pilots could slip through gaps in American awareness, could strike before being detected. This belief would cost them everything. How does a weapon you cannot see destroy an empire built on warriors? How does mathematics defeat spirit? How do spinning antennas and electromagnetic pulses rewrite the rules of warfare so completely that pilots begin to question reality itself? This is not a story of dogfights, though planes will fall. It is not about heroes, though brave men will die. This is a story about the moment when war became something else entirely, when the battlefield expanded beyond what could be touched or seen, when victory belonged not to the fiercest, but to those who could sense the invisible. It is the story of radar. And it is the story of Japanese pilots who flew into the sky only to discover they had been watched all along, tracked, calculated, anticipated. Their greatest strength, the element of surprise, had become their fatal weakness. The waves that doomed them hummed quietly, indifferent to courage. The birth of radar was not dramatic. It began in laboratories with equations and curious minds probing the properties of radio waves. In the 1,930 seconds, British and American scientists discovered something peculiar. Electromagnetic pulses bounced off metal objects. Aircraft specifically. Send out a wave, measure its return, calculate distance and speed. Simple in theory, revolutionary in practice. In 1937, Japanese naval intelligence received reports of these experiments. Officers reviewed the findings in a wood-paneled room in Tokyo, sunlight filtering through paper screens. They discussed the concept briefly, then dismissed it. Scientific fantasy, they concluded. Impractical for warfare. The ocean was too vast, the technology too theoretical. Japan's focus remained on perfecting what already worked. Faster planes, better torpedoes, more disciplined pilots. The Americans and British continued their work in silence. By 1941, the United States had deployed the SCR-270 radar system. It was crude by later standards, bulky, temperamental, requiring constant adjustment. But it worked. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, an SCR-270 station on Oahu detected incoming aircraft while they were still 132 miles away. The operators reported it. The information was dismissed as a flight of B-17 seconds. Pearl Harbor burned anyway, but the technology had proven itself. It had seen the attack coming. After Pearl Harbor, radar stopped being a curiosity. It became sacred. Across America, factories retooled. Engineers who had been designing radios for civilian use now bent their minds toward military applications. Technicians welded parabolic antennas in warehouses that ran 24 hours without rest. Women assembled circuit boards under fluorescent lights, their fingers moving with mechanical precision. The components were delicate vacuum tubes that glowed amber when powered capacitors that could fail from a single jostle wiring that had to be perfect, or the entire system went blind. On ships, being fitted for war, radar arrays rose like skeletal crowns. Operators trained on equipment that seemed almost mystical green scopes that showed glowing dots representing aircraft, each sweep of the display arm revealing a fresh picture of the invisible sky. They learned to distinguish between clouds and planes, between friendly formations and enemy raids. They sat in darkened rooms called radar shacks, whispering coordinates to gunnery crews, their voices calm even as their hearts hammered. The radar pulse itself was invisible, imperceptible. It traveled at the speed of light, bouncing off metal and returning with information encoded in microseconds of delay. A plane 50 miles away meant the pulse took a specific fraction of time to return. 100 miles, double the delay. The mathematics was elegant. The implications were terrifying. War had always been about seeing the enemy first. Radar made that contest fundamentally unfair. Japan's engineers were not ignorant. Some understood what was happening. In research facilities in Kure and Tokyo, a handful of scientists worked on their own radar prototypes machines that hummed and occasionally detected aircraft. But resources were scarce, and the military's faith lay elsewhere in the spirit of the warrior, in the skill of pilots, in offensive power rather than defensive technology. Radar projects received minimal funding. Prototypes sat unused. Reports were filed and forgotten. By late 1943, the gap had become a chasm. America deployed thousands of radar sets. Japan had fewer than 50 operational units. The war of steel and fire was becoming a war of signals, of frequencies and wavelengths, of invisible mathematics humming through the air. It was a war where the battlefield extended 100 miles in every direction, where night and fog no longer provided cover, where surprise itself had become nearly impossible. And Japan didn't see it coming. The Pacific Ocean is not one battlefield, but 10,000. Islands scattered like broken teeth across impossible distances. Between them, only water and sky, endless and indifferent. To control this vastness, you must see it, all of it, simultaneously. The United States Navy understood this. By 1944, they had woven a spiderweb of invisible sight across the entire theater. It began with the islands, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Guadalcanal. Each captured landmass became a node in an ever-expanding network. Engineers arrived behind the infantry, sometimes while fighting still echoed in the jungles. They erected radar towers, skeletal metal structures rising above palm trees, topped with rotating dishes that swept the horizon in endless circles. Each station could monitor hundreds of square miles of sky. Each operator could see what would have required dozens of scouts, hundreds of binoculars, an army of watchful eyes. The young men who operated these stations were often barely 20 years old. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit. Students who had been studying literature or engineering before the war interrupted everything. Now they sat in humid shacks watching green screens glow in the darkness, waiting for specks of light to appear on the sweeping display. Hour after hour, day after day, the radar arm rotated, one sweep, two sweeps, three, painting the same empty sky over and over. Then suddenly a dot, then two, then six. The operator's hand would move to the intercom voice, steady despite the adrenaline. Bogies inbound bearing 270 distance, 80 miles, altitude 12,000, 80 miles. More than an hour before the enemy planes would be visible to the naked eye. Time enough to scramble fighters, time enough to prepare anti-aircraft batteries, time enough to turn an ambush into a slaughter. The fleet itself became a moving fortress of awareness. Destroyers equipped with radar formed picket lines miles ahead of carrier groups, their dishes spinning, constantly searching. Cruisers and battleships mounted fire control radar systems that could track individual aircraft and feed targeting data directly to guns. The guns themselves could fire through clouds, through darkness, through conditions where human eyes were useless. They followed invisible instructions from machines that never blinked, never tired, never doubted. On the bridge of every major vessel, a new room emerged, the Combat Information Center. The CIC was the brain of the ship, a darkened chamber where radar screens and plotting tables transformed raw data into tactical understanding. Officers stood over maps marked with grease pencils, watching as reports flowed in from a dozen radar stations. Aircraft positions updated every few seconds. Enemy formations materialized from empty sky. The fog of war, humanity's ancient curse, began to lift. American fleets could now see in a complete sphere, 360 degrees around from sea level to 40,000 feet, extending outward for more than 100 miles. It was coverage so total, so overwhelming, that commanders began to trust the machines more than their own instincts. Meanwhile, across the same ocean, Japanese forces still relied on spotters with binoculars, shore watchers scanning for smoke trails, pilots reporting enemy positions by radio after visual contact. Methods that had worked for centuries, but were now as obsolete as swords against machine guns. The mathematics of it was brutal. A radar network covering the Pacific meant that nearly every Japanese aircraft from the moment it achieved altitude was visible to someone. Somewhere a green dot appeared on a scope. Somewhere an operator made a note. Somewhere the information flowed into the vast American awareness. For every zero that took off believing itself unseen, a radar pulse had already whispered its existence into the network. The sky had become transparent. The ocean had grown eyes, and Japan flew on still blind. Imperial Japan had built its war machine on a foundation of belief, not merely strategy or industrial capacity, but faith. Faith that spirit could transcend material limitation, that discipline and sacrifice could overcome technological disparity, that the warrior's will was the ultimate weapon. This belief was not baseless. In the early years, it had proven devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots had swept through Southeast Asia with a ferocity that stunned the world. Their Zero fighters outmaneuvered everything they encountered. Their tactics were bold, their execution flawless. Victory after victory reinforced the doctrine spirit triumphs over science. But faith, when unbending, becomes blindness. In research laboratories across Japan, a different story was unfolding. Engineers hunched over workbenches understood what their military commanders did not. They had studied reports from the front, they had examined wreckage of American ships, and found the telltale equipment, radar arrays, receivers, transmitters. They knew the Americans were fighting with mathematics, with electromagnetic precision, with technology that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. One engineer in particular, working in a cramped facility in Kure, spent months developing prototypes. The Type 2 Mark I radar, crude but functional. It could detect aircraft at modest ranges, could provide early warning if properly deployed. He submitted report after report to the Navy Ministry, each one more urgent than the last. "The enemy fights with invisible eyes," he wrote in one memo. "We are blind by comparison. This gap will destroy us." The reports were filed, meetings were held. Then the funding went elsewhere, to kamikaze aircraft, to battleship construction, to conventional weapons that aligned with traditional understanding of warfare. Radar was acknowledged but not prioritized. It seemed abstract, unproven in the crucible of Japanese military philosophy. Better to invest in what had already brought success. By 1944, the disparity was staggering. The United States operated more than 6,000 radar installations across the Pacific theater. Japan had fewer than 50 functional units. Most were primitive, short-range, often unreliable. None were integrated into a coherent defensive network. They existed as isolated curiosities rather than elements of systematic strategy. The engineer in Kure continued his work anyway. He sketched antenna designs that would never be built. He calculated frequencies for systems that would never receive approval. Late at night in a workshop illuminated by a single bulb, he stared at his equations and understood with perfect clarity that his country was losing a war most of its leaders didn't even recognize was happening. Other voices tried to warn. Junior officers who had survived encounters with American forces returned with stories that sounded impossible. They see us before we see them, always. It's as if they know our flight paths before we take off. These accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, as the excuses of defeated men trying to explain failure without admitting weakness. The culture of the imperial military did not reward such warnings. It rewarded confidence, aggression, unwavering commitment to doctrine. To suggest that Japan needed to fundamentally rethink its approach was to question the superiority of Japanese spirit, an unthinkable heresy. So, the warnings went unheeded. The radar programs languished. Resources that might have closed the gap instead flowed toward conventional weapons, toward tactics designed for a war that no longer existed. In the contest between faith and frequency, faith had become a liability. The invisible battlefield, the realm of electromagnetic waves and mathematical prediction, belonged entirely to the Americans. Japan continued to fight with courage and skill, but courage cannot deflect a radar-guided shell, and skill means nothing when the enemy sees you before you even know they're there. The myth of invisibility, Japan's greatest strategic asset in the early war, had become a delusion. And delusions, no matter how deeply held, shatter when they meet reality. That shattering was about to begin. December 1944. Iwo Jima sits like a wound in the ocean, volcanic and brutal. The island is a staging ground, a launching point for strikes against American fleets, attempting to close the distance to Japan's home islands. In the pre-dawn darkness, kamikaze units prepare for what they believe will be a devastating surprise attack. Lieutenant Kojiro Takahashi climbs into his Zero fighter. He is 23 years old. He has flown 17 combat missions. He has written his final letters home, tucked them into his jacket pocket, where they rest against his heart. Around him, other pilots perform their own rituals, silent prayers, glances at photographs, the tightening of flight harnesses with hands that betray no tremor. The plan is elegant in its simplicity. Launch before dawn, fly low across the water, strike the American fleet while the ships are silhouetted against the rising sun. The element of surprise is total. No scouts have spotted them. The Americans are hours away beyond visual range, unaware. Engines ignite. Propellers slice the humid air into rhythmic thunder. The Zeros taxi toward the runway wheels bouncing over volcanic rock. Takahashi advances the throttle. The runway stretches ahead, darkness giving way to the faint grey of approaching dawn. Before his wheels leave the ground, the world explodes. Shells burst across the runway. Not random fire, but precise, targeted directly at the concentration of aircraft. Shrapnel tears through wings. One Zero erupts in flames before achieving takeoff speed. Another veers sideways, propeller shredding itself against rock. Takahashi pulls back on the stick, gets airborne through sheer, desperate momentum, his plane shuddering from impacts he cannot see. In the air, confusion becomes terror. Anti-aircraft fire erupts from ships that are still invisible beyond the horizon. The shells form a wall of exploding metal trajectories calculated with impossible accuracy. It's as if the Americans knew the exact altitude, the exact heading, the exact moment of the attack. Because they did. On a destroyer positioned 40 miles offshore, radar operators had watched the entire preparation. They saw engines start the heat signatures distinct on their screens. They watched the aircraft taxi, counted them, calculated their probable heading based on the runway orientation. Before the first Zero achieved altitude, targeting data was already flowing to gunnery crews. The guns trained themselves on coordinates provided by machines that had been watching the invisible. Takahashi survives the initial barrage through luck and violent evasive maneuvers. 6 of his squadron do not. He banks hard, trying to descend back into the relative safety of low altitude. His mind races, trying to comprehend what just happened. There were no American aircraft overhead, no flares, no warning. The attack was launched in darkness, from an island the Americans could not possibly see from their position. Yet they knew. They knew everything. Years later, in a post-war interview, Takahashi would struggle to articulate the experience. It was impossible, he said, staring at nothing in particular. Before our wheels left the ground, the ships opened fire. Precise fire, not blind shooting, targeted. We thought we were invisible. We thought distance and darkness protected us. But it was as if the enemy could see through the clouds, through the night itself. As if they were watching us from the moment we climbed into our cockpits. Other pilots who survived similar encounters described the same sensation, a creeping horror that transcended physical danger. The battlefield had rules. You could be outmaneuvered, outgunned, overwhelmed by numbers. But you could not be seen when you were invisible. That was physics. That was reality. Except it wasn't anymore. The sky itself had betrayed them. The very air carried their secrets to the enemy. And in that realization, something fundamental broke, not just tactical confidence, but the deeper assumption that they understood the nature of the war they were fighting. They didn't. Radar did not merely detect aircraft. It predicted them. The data streaming from those rotating dishes, bearing distance, altitude, speed, fed into a new kind of warfare, one governed by calculation rather than instinct. On American ships, early analog computers received the radar information and began processing it with mechanical precision. These machines' assemblies of gears and electrical relays computed trajectories. They anticipated where an aircraft would be 5 seconds from now, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. They accounted for wind, for the aircraft's likely speed, for the time it would take a shell to arc through the air. The result was something that seemed like magic, but was merely mathematics made lethal. Fire control radar allowed battleships to engage targets they could not see. A Japanese bomber approaching through cloud cover at night, invisible to every human eye on the ship, was nevertheless tracked with perfect clarity. The main guns swiveled to coordinates provided by machines. They fired into darkness. And seconds later, somewhere in that darkness, metal met metal in a brief, catastrophic bloom of fire. The operators who worked these systems described the experience in terms that mixed awe with unease. It felt like fighting with perfect vision in absolute darkness, one radar technician recalled. You could see everything on the scope, every plane, every ship, even weather systems appearing as patterns of return signals. The enemy was blind, stumbling while we watched them from somewhere they couldn't comprehend. On every major American vessel, the Combat Information Center became the true command post. Here, officers made decisions based not on what they could see from the bridge, but on what machines told them existed beyond sight. Radar contacts appeared as marks on plotting tables. Trajectories were drawn in grease pencil. Threats were identified and prioritized before they became visible threats. The entire geometry of naval warfare had been reimagined around these glowing green screens. The machines never slept, never lost focus, never experienced fear or fatigue. A human lookout after hours of staring at empty ocean might miss the distant speck of an approaching aircraft. Radar missed nothing. It swept and swept and swept, indifferent and tireless, building a picture of the battlefield that was more complete than any human awareness could achieve. For Japanese forces, this created an enemy that seemed omniscient. How did American ships avoid ambushes so consistently? How did they know to launch fighters minutes before an attack arrived? How did their gunfire find targets through fog and smoke and night? The answers involved no mysticism, no superior instinct, only technology that functioned beyond the visible spectrum. Japanese pilots still fought by eye. They searched for targets visually. They navigated by compass and landmarks. They coordinated attacks by radio communication and prearranged timing, all methods that had worked for decades. All methods that assumed both sides operated under the same limitations of human perception. But the Americans weren't operating under those limitations anymore. In the growing collection of after-action reports, Japanese commanders struggled to explain consistent failures. The enemy anticipates our movements, one report stated. They respond to our attacks before our aircraft are in range. Their defensive fire begins at distances that should be impossible. We suspect new technology, but its nature remains unclear. The nature was electromagnetic radiation, traveling at the speed of light. The nature was vacuum tubes and cathode ray displays. The nature was a revolution in warfare that had occurred almost silently without dramatic announcements, while Japan's focus remained fixed on traditional measures of military power. The battlefield was no longer defined by what men could see, but by what machines could sense. And those machines, humming quietly in darkened rooms across the Pacific, were rewriting every rule of engagement. Japan flew on skilled and brave and increasingly irrelevant, fighting a war that had already transformed into something they couldn't quite grasp. The mathematics was pitiless. By late 1944, reality could no longer be ignored. The pattern was too consistent, the losses too catastrophic, the enemy's accuracy too impossible to dismiss as coincidence. In conference rooms in Tokyo, naval officers finally began to grasp the scope of their disadvantage. Japan launched a desperate race to catch up. Engineers who had been sidelined for years suddenly found their projects granted urgent priority. Captured British radar equipment salvaged from destroyed installations in Singapore and Burma was transported back to Japan for examination. Scientists disassembled the units with careful hands, tracing circuits, measuring frequencies, trying to reverse engineer years of development they had missed. The technology itself was not incomprehensible. The principles were sound, the physics well understood. But understanding and implementation are separated by an ocean of resources, manufacturing capacity, and time commodities Japan no longer possessed. In underground laboratories, shielded from the American bombing raids that now came with terrifying regularity, teams worked around the clock. They built prototypes, tested transmission ranges, calibrated receivers, created systems that could in theory detect approaching aircraft at useful distances. Some units actually functioned. They hummed to life their screens, showing faint traces of electromagnetic returns, proof that Japanese engineers could match the concept. But the nation that had to build them was collapsing. One scientist interviewed decades later described the bitter irony with painful clarity. "We successfully developed a radar system that could detect B-29 seconds at 70 kilometers. It was a genuine achievement built with insufficient materials under impossible conditions. But we had no reliable electricity to run it. The power grid was failing. Generators were needed elsewhere. We could see the bombers on our screen for perhaps 20 minutes before the power died. Then we watched the actual bombers arrive, visible in the sky, while our useless equipment sat dark and silent. The factories that might have produced radar units in quantity were being destroyed by the very aircraft they were meant to detect. The supply chains that might have delivered components had been severed by American submarines. The electrical infrastructure that might have powered a defensive network was crumbling under sustained bombardment. Meanwhile, overhead, American B-29 superfortresses flew with radar-equipped navigation systems that allowed them to bomb through cloud cover at night with a precision that would have been impossible years earlier. They found their targets without seeing them. They flew above the reach of most Japanese fighters, and when fighters did manage to intercept radar-equipped night fighters, often found and destroyed them before visual contact occurred. The Americans were bombing Japan with technology that Japan was simultaneously trying to develop for defense. The circle was closed, the trap complete. In one underground facility near Nagoya, an engineering team managed to construct a functioning early warning radar system. They mounted it on a hillside, calibrated it properly, established communication links to air defense headquarters. For 2 weeks it operated flawlessly, providing advance warning of incoming bomber formations. Then, American intelligence identified the installation through signals analysis. A single bombing raid reduced it to rubble and twisted metal. The team rebuilt it in a different location. It was destroyed again within days. Japan had entered a war where innovation alone was insufficient. The radar gap had widened into an abyss that could not be crossed through effort or ingenuity. The empire that had once led the world in optical technology, that had manufactured cameras and binoculars of extraordinary quality, found itself blind beneath an invisible sun. Knowledge had arrived too late. Understanding without implementation is merely the ability to comprehend your own defeat in technical terms. The engineers knew what was killing them. They knew how it worked. They knew with devastating precision why they could not replicate it in time to matter. The bombers kept coming, seen long before they arrived, yet unstoppable regardless. Spring 1945, Okinawa. The island sits just 340 miles from mainland Japan, close enough that its capture will put American bombers within easy reach of every major city. Japan understands this. The defense of Okinawa is not merely tactical, it is existential. Every available resource, every remaining aircraft, every pilot willing to die is directed towards stopping the American advance. The result is the largest sustained kamikaze campaign of the war. Thousands of suicide aircraft, waves upon waves, hurled against the American fleet in an operation called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. It is courage, weaponized desperation, given wings. If spirit alone could turn the tide, this would be the moment. But the Americans are ready with technology that turns courage into mathematics. The fleet at Okinawa is protected by a revolutionary deployment radar picket destroyers. These ships position themselves miles ahead of the main fleet, forming an invisible fence of electromagnetic awareness. Their sole purpose is to see. They bristle with radar arrays, their dishes spinning constantly, watching the sky in every direction simultaneously. They are sacrificial sentinels, knowingly placed in harm's way to provide advance warning. In the combat information centers of these destroyers, operators stare at green screens that suddenly bloom with contacts. Not one or two, but dozens, then hundreds. The scope fills with glowing dots, each representing a kamikaze aircraft approaching from Kyushu. The operators' voices remain steady as they call out the impossible numbers into radio handsets. Multiple bogies bearing 350, range 90 miles, estimate 400 plus aircraft inbound. 400 aircraft, all committed to dying, all aimed at the fleet with suicidal precision. The radar provides something priceless: time. 90 miles means 30 minutes of warning at typical kamikaze approach speeds. 30 minutes to scramble combat air patrol fighters. 30 minutes to prepare anti-aircraft batteries, 30 minutes to position ships and distribute defensive fire. Without radar, the first warning would come when the kamikazes appeared on the horizon, perhaps 5 minutes before impact, perhaps less. The air battle that follows is apocalyptic. American fighters, directed by radar controllers, intercept the formations far from the fleet. Vector 2, 8-0 Angels, 12 Bandits, 40 miles coordinates, flowing from radar screens to pilot headsets, turning the sky into a grid of mathematical certainty. The fighters arrive exactly where they're needed, exactly when they're needed, because the machines told them where to go. Those kamikazes that penetrate the fighter screen encounter something equally devastating: radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire. The guns track targets through clouds, through smoke, through the chaos of battle. They fire not where the aircraft is, but where it will be. Trajectories, calculated by machines faster and more accurate than human gunnery ever achieved. Still, some get through. The radar picket destroyers positioned forward absorb horrific punishment. Kamikazes slam into their hulls with explosive finality. Ships burn, men die. But even in their destruction, the picket destroyers fulfill their purpose. They saw the attack coming, provided warning, allowed the main fleet to prepare. Japanese survivors described the battle in terms of hopelessness. One pilot, who turned back after his aircraft was damaged, recalled, "They saw us before we existed. The American fighters were waiting at our exact altitude, at our exact heading. Their ships fired at us through clouds we thought would hide us. It was like fighting ghosts who knew our every thought. Thousands of kamikaze sorties, thousands of young men flying to certain death. And despite all that sacrifice, despite all that courage, the American losses were manageable. Not light men still died, ships still sank, but manageable, proportional. The mathematics of radar-directed defense meant that even overwhelming numbers could be systematically reduced to acceptable attrition. Okinawa became the first fully radar-integrated battle in human history. Every element of the American defense fighters, guns, ship, positioning, damage control, coordinated through electromagnetic awareness. The gods of war had gone blind. Machines had replaced prophecy. August 1945. The war ends not with radar, but with atomic fire. Yet when the surrender documents are signed, when Japanese officials board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the asymmetry that doomed them is finally completely visible. In the months following surrender, American occupation forces catalog Japan's military technology. Japanese engineers are brought in to examine captured American radar equipment for the first time, not fragments salvaged from wrecks, but complete functioning systems. They study the units with expressions that shift from professional curiosity to something approaching disbelief. The complexity is staggering. These are not merely more advanced versions of what Japan had attempted. They represent an entirely different philosophy of engineering, modular design, mass production, optimization, integration of multiple systems into coherent networks. The Americans had not just built radar, they had built an entire ecosystem of detection, communication, and response that functioned as a unified organism. One Japanese radar engineer standing before an American AN/APS-6 unit in a warehouse in Yokosuka touches the equipment with something like reverence. "We never understood what we were fighting," he says quietly to a translator. "We thought it was ships and planes and soldiers. We didn't realize we were fighting an entire infrastructure of invisible awareness. This," he gestures at the radar set, "this is not a weapon, it is a nervous system, and we had no equivalent." The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. By war's end, the United States had deployed more than 1,000,000 radar sets across all theaters. Japan, in its entire wartime production, had manufactured fewer than 1,000 units, most of them primitive by comparison. The gap was not merely technological but philosophical, a difference in how each nation conceived of warfare itself. Yet from this defeat, something unexpected emerges. Japan's post-war recovery is built in part on the very technology that defeated it. Engineers who had worked on radar projects during the war transition into civilian electronics. The principles of electromagnetic detection of precision, manufacturing of miniaturization, all the skills they had desperately tried to develop under fire, become the foundation for a new industrial revolution. Companies like Toshiba and Sony trace their post-war success directly to radar-related research. The scientists who had sketched antenna designs in underground laboratories now design transistor radios and television sets. The engineers who had struggled to build detection equipment with inadequate resources become pioneers of consumer electronics. The precision that couldn't save the empire becomes the precision that rebuilds it. There is bitter irony in this transformation. The electromagnetic waves that marked Japan's pilots for destruction become the carrier waves for entertainment and communication. The rotating dishes that swept the sky for targets become satellite receivers. The cathode ray tubes that displayed approaching bombers as glowing dots become television screens showing baseball games and variety shows. In 1946, a photograph is taken at a technical college in Tokyo. It shows a Japanese scientist, one of the engineers who had worked on radar development during the war, standing before a captured American radar dish. His hand rests on the mounting bracket. His expression is difficult to read, perhaps contemplation, perhaps respect, perhaps the complex emotion of understanding too late what might have been possible with different priorities, different choices, different faith in the power of invisible sight. The same waves that doomed them would eventually rebuild them. The technology that shattered their empire would seed their resurrection. War's cruelty has many forms, but perhaps none more complex than this, being defeated by something you could have developed given different circumstances, different timing, different belief in what constituted true strength. The radar dishes spin in memory, tracking ghosts across empty sky. The green screens glow in history, showing battles that are over but never quite finished. The electromagnetic pulses travel still invisible and indifferent, carrying no meaning except what humans assign to them. The age of the unseen had begun, and it would never end. In the end, radar was more than a weapon. It was revelation. It demonstrated that power had shifted, no longer residing in muscle or courage, but in knowledge, in the ability to sense what others could not. The pilots who once trusted the horizon learned that even the sky could betray them. Distance offered no protection. Darkness provided no cover. Invisibility was an illusion that technology had shattered. Those who listened to silence, to static, to invisible echoes bouncing through the air shaped the world that followed. They proved that the future belonged not to the bravest, but to those who could see furthest into the invisible. War had changed. The battlefield was no longer seen. It was sensed, measured, predicted by machines that never blinked. For Japan's pilots, the realization came too late. The Americans had seen them before they even took flight, before their engines ignited, before they believed they could be found. The age of the unseen had begun.